The scent of damp grass and the distant lowing of cattle were the last sounds Mrs. Ilara expected to hear. In her wheelchair, frail and bewildered, she was left there, in the middle of a vast and silent pasture, under the cold gaze of her own son. He, a successful businessman, saw his mother not as a beloved being, but as the final obstacle to a hefty inheritance. "Nature will take care of it," he thought, as the car engine rumbled, ready to whisk him back to his luxurious life, far from the manned wolves that he knew roamed those lands. Mrs. Ilara, with tears welling in her eyes, only felt the icy wind and a growing fear. But nature, at times, has its own guardians and destiny, its own rules. And a retired rodeo bull, scarred from 1,000 battles, was about to show the businessman that not every inheritance can be bought, and not every mother can be abandoned with impunity. The roar of the engine was music to Marcus's ears, a sound of freedom, of an unhindered future, of an inheritance finally within reach. He cast a final glance in the rearview mirror, his mother's frail figure in her wheelchair, shrinking on the horizon, almost swallowed by the vastness of the pasture. A cold, satisfied smile curved his lips. Nature, he thought, would be a silent and efficient accomplice. No one would blame him. No one would ever know. But nature, that day, had other plans. Mrs. Ilara, with the icy wind whipping her aged face, felt despair tighten its grip on her chest. Tears, already dry from the air, left salty tracks on her skin. The scent of damp earth and dry grass filled her nostrils, and the heavy silence of the field was broken only by the distant lowing of cattle, and now by a closer sound, a rustling in the tall grass that made her heart pound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the cattle. It was something more furtive, more predatory. Maned wolves, she knew, were creatures of the night, but hunger didn't wait for dusk. As panic set in, a colossal shadow fell over her. It wasn't the shadow of a wolf, but something much larger, more imposing. A dark, massive figure, head lowered, eyes fixed on the car that was beginning to move. It was Colossus, the retired rodeo bull, a living legend of the hinterlands, whose scars told tales of arenas and an indomitable strength. He was no longer a show animal, but a silent guardian of those lands, and of all that dwelled within them. Marcos, feeling the car engage and begin to roll, was already celebrating his escape. But something was wrong. The vehicle wasn't gaining speed as it should. A subtle tremor ran through the chassis, and the sound of heavy hooves dragging on the damp earth reached his ears. He looked to the side, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Colossus, the bull, was there, not just standing, but moving with terrifying determination, circling Mrs. Ilara's wheelchair, as if drawing an invisible barrier, a circle of protection. The bull, with his sharp horns and tense musculature, seemed to have stepped out of an ancient nightmare. His deep brown eyes burned with an intelligence and fury Marcos would never have expected from an animal. Colossus wasn't just protecting the elderly woman, he was staring down Marcus's car, a palpable threat in every fiber of his being. "What the hell?" Marcos muttered, his voice choked with shock. He tried to accelerate, the tire spinning uselessly on the wet grass, mud splattering backward. The car skidded but didn't move forward. Colossus had positioned himself. The bull wasn't a static obstacle, he was a force of nature, a wall of flesh and bone that moved with a predator's precision. Mrs. Ilara, watching the scene, felt a mix of terror and a strange flicker of hope. That animal, which should have been a threat, seemed to be her only chance. Colossus's deep bellow reverberated across the pasture, a warning, a declaration of war. And then the bull did something that defied all logic. He lowered his head, scraping the ground with a hoof, and charged. It wasn't a blind attack, it was a calculated charge aimed at the side of Marcos's car. The impact was brutal. A dull thud that made the vehicle rock violently. Marcos screamed, clutching the steering wheel, his heart pounding erratically. He tried to reverse, but Colossus wouldn't yield. The bull retreated a few steps, breathing heavily, and then charged again, this time with even greater fury. Colossus's horns gouged into the car's bodywork, tearing the metal as easily as paper. The vehicle, a luxury SUV, began to tilt precariously. Marcos felt terror seize every cell of his body. He was no longer in control. The world spun. The engine roared in agony as the bull, with a force that seemed to defy gravity, pushed, lifted, and with one last powerful surge, flipped Marcus's car upside down. The crash of twisting metal and shattering glass echoed across the pasture. The SUV toppled, wheels skyward, the engine sputtering and dying in an abrupt, deafening silence. Dense smoke began to rise from the crumpled hood. Marcos, trapped upside down by his seatbelt, felt a searing pain in his head and shoulders. The smell of gasoline and oil filled the car's interior, suffocating. Outside, Mrs. Ilara watched, shocked, the result of the bull's fury. Colossus, panting but victorious, remained beside the overturned car for a few moments, like a judge who had just delivered his verdict. Then, with the same silent determination, he returned to his post, completing the protective circle around Mrs. Ilara's wheelchair. His eyes, previously fixed on Marcos, now scanned the horizon, alert to other threats. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But the beauty of twilight was overshadowed by the growing darkness spreading across the pasture. And with the darkness came the sounds. A distant howl, sharp and melancholic, tore through the afternoon silence, answered by another, closer one. The maned wolves. They were coming, and now there were two prisoners in the pasture, a helpless elderly woman, protected by a bull, and an ambitious businessman trapped in his own overturned vehicle, at the mercy of the falling night and the hungry eyes that gleamed in the gloom. Marcos's world had turned upside down, literally. Trapped by his seatbelt, blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, mixing with the cold sweat beading on his skin. The smell of gasoline and burnt oil was suffocating, pungent, a premonition of disaster. The smoke rising from the crumpled hood wasn't just a sign of damage, it was a countdown to something far worse. The luxurious SUV, now a twisted wreck, groaned and creaked, each sound an echo of his own terror. He tried to free himself, his hands slipping on the damp fabric of the seat, his body heavy and awkward. Panic was a wild beast tearing at his chest. The inheritance, the unhindered future, all seemed ridiculous in the face of impending death. Outside, Mrs. Ilara watched the scene with a complex mix of shock, despair, and a cold pang of something akin to justice. Her son, the man who had mercilessly abandoned her, was now as helpless as she was, perhaps even more so, but there was little time for moral reflections. Twilight advanced, painting the sky with brushstrokes of fire and ash, and with it, darkness brought its own horrors. The howls, once distant and melancholic, were now closer, more numerous, and laden with an ancestral hunger. Colossus, the bull, did not linger to contemplate his victory over the vehicle. His eyes, previously fixed on Marcos, now scanned the horizon with renewed intensity. He knew the greater threat was just beginning. With a low, guttural bellow that seemed to vibrate through the very earth, he adjusted his position, completing the protective circle around Mrs. Ilara's wheelchair. His muscles tense beneath his thick hide, horns pointed outward. He was the wall, the guardian, the last hope against the approaching night. Mrs. Ilara felt the icy air penetrate her bones. Her eyes, already accustomed to the gloom, tried to discern the shadows dancing in the tall grass. The rustling, previously sporadic, became a sinister chorus of furtive movements. Small golden glints like embers floating in the darkness began to emerge from among the bushes. The manned wolves. They weren't just one or two. The pack was there, drawn by the scent of fear, of flesh, and perhaps by the metallic aroma of Marcos's blood. Inside the overturned car, Marcos fought against his seatbelt, against the pain, against the claustrophobia. The smell of gasoline was unbearable, and the increasingly dense smoke scratched at his throat. He coughed, gagged, his face pale and sweaty. "Mother!" he cried, his voice hoarse and desperate, a sound he never thought he would utter. It was a primitive plea, a cry for help to the very person he had condemned. But his scream was swallowed by the heavy silence of the pasture, and by the howls that now seemed to come from all directions. Colossus responded to the howls with a powerful snort, scraping the ground with a hoof, a display of strength and defiance. He was not a hunting animal, but his ferocity in protecting what he considered his territory was legendary. Mrs. Ilara, watching the bull, felt a strange calm. That animal, which should have been her predator, was now her shield. She could feel the vibration of the wolves' steps on the earth, could hear the snapping of dry branches, the low, excited growl that preceded the attack. A slender, reddish figure emerged from the grass, stopping a few meters from Colossus's protective circle. Its eyes, like flames in the darkness, fixed on Mrs. Ilara, then on the bull. Other wolves followed, forming a cautious semicircle, assessing the situation, the scent of prey, the bull's challenge. They were cunning predators, accustomed to hunting in packs, to exploiting weakness. And there, in the center, was a frail, elderly woman. Marcos finally managed to loosen his seatbelt. With a groan of pain, he fell onto the car's roof, now the floor. The impact made his head throb even more. He fumbled in the dark, searching for an exit, any opening. The window glass was shattered, but the twisted metal frame blocked the passage. The smoke was growing thicker, and the engine's heat was becoming noticeable. He was cooking inside his own metal trap. Outside, the tension was palpable. The manned wolves, with their wild elegance, began to move in a tighter circle, testing Colossus's limits. They were patient, but hunger was a relentless master. Colossus turned slowly, following the pack's movements. His horns always pointed at the nearest threat. Mrs. Ilara, huddled in her wheelchair, felt her heart pound erratically, the night's cold mixing with the heat of fear. She could see the wolves' sharp teeth, the hungry gleam in their eyes. The night was just beginning, and the battle for survival, in the middle of that forgotten pasture, was about to erupt. Marcos's world, turned upside down, was now a torture chamber. The smell of gasoline and burnt oil, previously merely suffocating, became corrosive, burning his nostrils and throat. The dense, acrid smoke filled the SUV's interior, transforming the luxurious cabin into a deadly trap. He coughed convulsively, his lungs burning, his vision blurred by tears and soot. The engine's heat, previously only perceptible, now radiated like an oven, making the metal crackle and groan in protest. Each crack was a warning, a reminder of the imminence of something terrible. With a groan of pain, Marcos thrashed, his hands slipping on the damp fabric of the seat, now the floor. The seatbelt, which had previously held him, was now a tangle of straps that suffocated him. He managed to loosen it, but his body, heavy and awkward, was still trapped. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, mixing with the panic that overwhelmed him. He fumbled in the dark, searching for an exit, any glimmer of hope. The window glass was shattered, but the twisted metal frame blocked the passage, cutting his hands in desperate attempts. He was cooking inside his own metal trap, and time was running out. Outside, the tension was palpable, a macabre orchestra of night sounds. The manned wolves, with their wild elegance, moved in an increasingly tight circle, testing Colossus's limits. Their steps were almost silent on the damp grass, but the occasional rustle, the low, excited growl, and the intermittent gleam of their hungry eyes were more than enough to keep Mrs. Ilara in a state of paralyzing terror. She could feel the vibration of the wolves' steps on the earth, could hear the snapping of dry branches, the low, excited growl that preceded the attack. Colossus, the wall of flesh and bone, turned slowly, following the pack's movements. His sharp horns, like ancient spears, were always pointed at the nearest threat. The deep bellow that escaped his throat was not just a warning, it was a declaration of war, a direct challenge to the ancestral hunger that approached. He scraped the ground with a hoof, raising small clouds of earth, a display of strength that, for a moment, seemed to intimidate the predators. But hunger was a relentless master. A slender, reddish figure, the largest and boldest of the pack, emerged from the tall grass, stopping a few meters from Colossus's protective circle. Its eyes, like golden flames in the darkness, fixed on Mrs. Ilara, then on the bull, assessing the situation with cold intelligence. Other wolves followed, forming a cautious semicircle, their slender, muscular bodies tense, ready for the attack. They were cunning predators, accustomed to hunting in packs, to exploiting weakness. And there in the center was a frail, elderly woman protected by a giant. Mrs. Ilara, huddled in her wheelchair, felt her heart pound erratically, the night's cold mixing with the heat of fear. She could see the wolves' sharp teeth, the hungry gleam in their eyes. The night was just beginning, and the battle for survival in the middle of that forgotten pasture was about to erupt. Suddenly the lead wolf took a step forward, a louder, more challenging growl echoing across the pasture. It was the signal. In a coordinated movement, 3 wolves tried to flank Colossus, running in opposite directions, seeking an opening. The bull, however, was not slow. With surprising agility for his size, he spun, lowered his head and charged at the nearest wolf. The impact wasn't direct, but the force of the displaced air and the sound of his hoof scraping the earth were enough to make the wolf retreat with a startled yelp. The other wolves, seeing the bull's ferocity, hesitated for an instant, but hunger was stronger than fear. They continued to circle, seeking an opportunity, a flaw in Colossus's defense. The bull, panting but determined, held his ground, his eyes scanning the horizon, his muscles tense. Mrs. Ilara watched, her breath caught in her throat, each movement of the animals a promise of life or death. Inside the overturned car, Marcos heard the growls and yelps. The sound of the battle outside, mixed with the smell of smoke and gasoline, intensified his terror. He couldn't see, but he could imagine the horror unfolding. The smoke was now so dense he could barely breathe. The heat increased, and he could feel the car's metal warming beneath his hands. He was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of the night and the predators. With a cry of frustration and pain, he punched the car's roof, now the floor. The twisted metal wouldn't yield. He tried to kick the broken window, but the shards of glass and the metal frame were an insurmountable barrier. Despair transformed into rage, an impotent rage against himself, against the bull, against the mother who somehow seemed to have invoked this curse. Outside, the pack, realizing that Colossus was an impenetrable fortress from the front, began to change tactics. They spread out, some retreating into the darkness, others maintaining the siege. Mrs. Ilara felt a shiver. They were preparing for something. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the growls. It was the silence of the hunt, of strategy, of imminent death. Colossus, sensing the change, snorted again, his eyes fixed on the darkness, awaiting the next move. The night, which had previously promised only darkness, now brought with it a brutal and silent battle for survival, and Marcos, trapped in his own metal tomb, was merely an impotent witness to the terror unfolding, which could soon reach him. The silence that fell over the pasture was heavier than the darkness, colder than the night wind. It was not a silence of peace, but the calculating stillness that precedes a storm. The manned wolves, Masters in the art of hunting had retreated into the shadows, their slender forms disappearing into the tall grass, but their eyes, like floating embers, still betrayed their presence. Colossus, the guardian bull, felt the change in the atmosphere. His muscles were tense, every fiber of his body on alert. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes piercing the gloom, trying to decipher the pack's new strategy. The air vibrated with an invisible tension, the promise of an attack that would come from where it was least expected. For Mrs. Ilara, huddled in her wheelchair, that silence was a torment. Every distant rustle, every snap of a twig seemed like the prelude to a deadly leap. She could smell the strong, wild scent of the wolves, mixed with the earthy odor of the bull and the metallic aroma of her own fear. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm, a war drum in her chest. She looked at Colossus, his imposing figure, and saw not just an animal, but a wall of life, the last barrier between her and the hungry night. Inside the overturned car, Marcos was on the verge of collapse. The smell of gasoline and burnt oil was now a toxic cloud, suffocating him. The dense, acrid smoke burned his eyes and throat, turning each breath into agony. The engine's heat radiated, warming the car's metal to the point of burning his skin. He was in a metal oven, and time was running out. Panic, previously a wave, was now a tsunami, dragging him into the depths of despair. He coughed convulsively, his face covered in sweat and soot, his lungs begging for clean air. With a hoarse cry, he began to punch and kick the car's roof, now the floor, in a futile attempt to open a hole. The twisted metal groaned, but wouldn't yield. His knuckles were raw, his legs ached, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the terror of being burned alive. He fumbled desperately, his hands slipping on the damp fabric, searching for any object he could use. His fingers found the sharp edge of a twisted piece of metal from the window frame. Without thinking, he grabbed it, feeling blood trickle from his palm, and began to strike what remained of the glass, hoping to widen the opening. Each blow was an act of desperation, a silent prayer for a chance to escape. Outside, the wolves' strategy was revealed. The silence was broken by a sharp, solitary howl coming from an unexpected direction, far from the protective circle. Colossus, for an instant, turned his head, his eyes fixed on the source of the sound. It was a distraction, a decoy, and it was precisely at that moment that the pack acted. Like reddish ghosts, 3 wolves emerged from the darkness, not from the front, but from the sides, rushing in a coordinated and silent attack. One of them, the leader, aimed directly at Mrs. Ilara, seeking the most obvious opening. The other 2 tried to flank Colossus, one from the right, one from the left, intending to unbalance him to create an opening for the main attack. Colossus, however, was a veteran of countless battles. His protective instinct was stronger than any distraction. With a roar that made the ground tremble, he spun with surprising speed, lowering his head and charging at the wolf approaching Mrs. Ilara. The impact was brutal. The wolf, caught off guard by the bull's ferocity and agility, was thrown aside with a yelp of pain, falling heavily onto the grass. But the victory was partial. The other 2 wolves, taking advantage of the moment Colossus was focused on the first, managed to get dangerously close. One tried to bite the bull's hind leg, while the other, with an agile leap, tried to reach the wheelchair. Mrs. Ilara screamed, a weak, hoarse sound, as the wolf approached, its sharp teeth gleaming in the darkness. She closed her eyes, awaiting the impact, the end. But Colossus, even with the pain of the bite on his leg, reacted with savage fury. He snorted, scraped the ground with his hoof, and with a powerful movement of his head, flung the wolf trying to reach her away, hitting it with the base of one of his horns. The wolf fell with a whimper, rolling on the grass before getting up unsteadily and retreating. The bull, panting but victorious, held his ground, his eyes red with fury, sweeping the pack that now retreated again into the shadows, licking their wounds. The tension did not lessen, it merely shifted form. The wolves had learned that Colossus was a formidable force, but hunger still drove them. They would not give up. Inside the car, Marcos heard the growls, the yelps, the bull's furious bellows, and his mother's scream. He couldn't see, but the orchestra of wild sounds painted a vivid picture of horror in his mind. The smell of smoke was unbearable, and the heat of the metal was becoming intolerable. He could smell his own skin burning. He was trapped, helpless, witnessing the battle for his mother's life while his own life was slipping away in a metal inferno. With a last, desperate effort, he used the piece of metal to try and widen the window opening. But the material was resistant, and his strength was fading. The car, his luxury tomb, was about to become his funeral pyre, and the night, outside, still held darker surprises. The pack, now more cautious but no less determined, began to employ a tactic of attrition. Instead of direct attacks, they took turns in quick charges and strategic retreats, seeking to exhaust Colossus. One wolf would dart to the right, forcing the bull to turn. Another would emerge from the left, testing his agility. They weren't seeking an immediate fatal blow, but rather a weakness, a moment of fatigue, a breach in the bull's unyielding defense. Colossus, with his injured leg, snorted heavily, his muscles trembling with effort. He responded to each threat with the same ferocity, but with every movement, the pain in his leg intensified and his breathing became more labored. Mrs. Ilara, watching the unequal struggle, felt a mix of admiration and despair. The bull was fighting for her life, and she could do nothing but watch, helpless as he wore himself out. The embers in the wolves' eyes seemed to gleam with a cruel intelligence, as if they knew time was on their side. Meanwhile, inside the car, Marcos's situation reached a critical point. Dense black smoke filled the cabin, making vision almost impossible and breathing a torture. He coughed uncontrollably, spitting a mixture of phlegm and soot. The piece of metal he used to strike the window fell from his trembling hands, his fingers slick with sweat and blood. He was dizzy, his head throbbing, the thin air stealing his consciousness. The heat was unbearable, and he could feel his skin burning from contact with the hot metal. The seat fabric, once luxurious, was now scorched and emitted a nauseating chemical smell. He knew he was dying. Panic gave way to a grim acceptance, a stupor induced by lack of oxygen. In his last moments of lucidity, a clear image surfaced in his mind, his mother's face, not the aged, frail face he had abandoned, but the young, smiling face from when he was a child, reading him a story before bed. A tear rolled down his grimy face, mixing with the soot. It was a tear of regret, late and useless. He tried to scream, but only a faint wheeze escaped his throat. His body relaxed, and darkness began to consume him. Outside, a new and disturbing smell began to spread across the pasture, overlaying the wild odor of the animals and the earthy scent of the grass. It was the unmistakable smell of burning rubber and melting plastic. Mrs. Ilara, even in her state of terror, noticed. She looked at the overturned car, and through the smoke that was now issuing in thicker wisps from the crevices, she saw an orange glow, faint at first, but rapidly intensifying. Fire was spreading. Marcos's car, the symbol of his fortune and his cruelty, was transforming into a funeral pyre. The smell of smoke and burning, now more intense, seemed to disturb even the wolves, who for an instant paused their attrition attacks, their muzzles sniffing the air with curiosity and caution. Colossus also caught the scent, and his eyes, previously fixed on the wolves, now briefly turned to the burning car. It was a grim reminder of Marcos's presence and of the cruel irony of fate that had united them on that infernal night. The battle for Mrs. Ilara's and Colossus's lives continued, but now a new threat, a new inferno ignited in the pasture. The orange glow, previously a mere premonition, now transformed into a voracious bonfire. Flames licked the interior of the overturned car, devouring the upholstery, the dashboard, everything in their path. The smell of burning rubber and melting plastic became oppressive, mixing with the thick smoke pouring from the broken windows and the crevices of the twisted metal. The luxury car, once a symbol of power and status, was now a funeral pyre, a flaming monument to cruelty and the irony of fate. Inside that metallic inferno, Marcos was jolted from the stupor of unconsciousness by a searing pain. The heat was unbearable, burning his skin, his hair, his clothes. He opened his eyes, but the dense smoke and dancing flames distorted his vision, transforming the car's interior into an infernal landscape. He coughed, a hoarse and desperate sound, and felt the hot, toxic air burn his lungs. Panic, which seemed to have dissipated in the darkness, returned with overwhelming force, a silent scream of terror in his mind. He wasn't just dying of asphyxiation. He was being burned alive. With a strength he didn't know he still possessed, Marcos tried to move, but the seatbelt held him like an iron noose. The car's metal was so hot it burned to the touch, and every movement was agony. He screamed, but the sound was muffled by the crackling flames and the distant roar of the wolves. His eyes, burning with pain and smoke, desperately searched for an exit. He saw the sharp piece of metal he had used before, fallen near his hand. With superhuman effort he grabbed it, feeling the flesh of his palm stick to the hot metal, and began to strike the seatbelt, a desperate attempt to free himself before the fire consumed him completely. Outside, Mrs. Ilara watched the macabre spectacle with a complex mix of horror and a strange, almost imperceptible sense of grim justice. The fire illuminated the pasture with a flickering light, revealing the silhouettes of the wolves that now moved with new audacity. The smell of burning was nauseating, but the heat of the flames, even at a distance, offered a bizarre contrast to the night's cold. She saw the car, her son's tomb, and in her tear-filled eyes, there was not only fear, but also the image of a past burning along with the present. Colossus, the guardian bull, felt the intense heat radiating from the car. His eyes, previously fixed on the wolves, now divided between the flaming threat and the pack that seemed invigorated by the chaos. His injured leg throbbed, and exhaustion weighed on his muscles, but the sight of the fire, a strange and dangerous element in his domain, made him even more alert. He snorted, dense vapor issuing from his nostrils, and scraped the ground with his hoof, a warning to the wolves and a challenge to the inferno that spread. The pack, indeed, had changed its tactics. The fire, with its light and heat, seemed to have awakened a more primitive fury in them. They no longer contented themselves with attrition attacks. Now, with the burning car serving as a macabre torch, they moved in a tighter circle, their eyes gleaming with a red intensity, reflecting the flames. The solitary howl was replaced by a chorus of low, menacing growls, a call to the final hunt. 3 wolves, the same ones that had tried to flank Colossus before, advanced simultaneously. One of them, the leader, again aimed at Mrs. Ilara, using the fire's light to calculate its leap. The other 2, with surprising speed, tried to bite Colossus's hind legs, seeking to immobilize him. The bull, even with the pain in his injured leg, reacted with an explosion of fury. He spun, pawing the air with his horns, and with a powerful movement, flung one of the wolves trying to bite his leg away. The animal yelped, falling heavily, but quickly got up, shaking its head. The leader, taking advantage of Colossus's distraction, leaped towards the wheelchair. Mrs. Ilara let out a muffled scream, her eyes wide with terror. She could see the wolf's sharp teeth, feel its hot, wild breath. But Colossus, with a roar that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, lunged forward, intercepting the wolf in mid-air. The impact was brutal. The bull struck the wolf with the side of his head, flinging it aside with a force that broke dry branches. The wolf fell with a whimper of pain, rolling on the grass before getting up unsteadily and retreating. But the victory was momentary. The third wolf, the most cunning, had taken advantage of the confusion. While Colossus was occupied with the leader, it crept up from behind and with an agile leap managed to bite the bull's already injured hind leg. Colossus let out a bellow of pain, a sound that made Mrs. Ilara shiver. He staggered, and for an instant his defense seemed to falter. The wolf, tasting blood, tightened its bite, trying to bring the giant down. Mrs. Ilara, seeing the bull fight with all his strength, felt a wave of despair. Colossus was exhausted, wounded, and now, with the fire raging and the wolves more aggressive than ever, he was on the verge of collapse. She looked at the burning car, where Marcos still struggled against his seatbelt, his body writhing in agony. The fire was now an uncontrolled inferno, flames rising high, illuminating the macabre scene with a red and orange glow. Inside the car, Marcos finally managed to cut one side of the seatbelt. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline propelled him. He tried to free himself, but the hot metal burned his skin and the smoke suffocated him. He was trapped, half free, half bound, in a metal oven that grew hotter with each passing second. The smell of his own burning flesh was unbearable. He coughed, and blood trickled from his mouth, mixing with the soot. He knew the end was near. Outside, Colossus, with a last roar of fury, managed to shake off the wolf biting him, flinging it away with a powerful kick. But the effort was immense. He snorted heavily, his legs trembling, and fell onto one knee, panting. His injured leg bled profusely, and his eyes, previously full of fury, now showed signs of exhaustion. Mrs. Ilara cried out the bull's name, a weak, hoarse sound, as the wolves, seeing their opportunity, advanced again, their eyes gleaming with the promise of a meal. Colossus's protective circle was broken, and the hungry night was about to claim its prey. The metallic inferno became Marcos's tomb. The cut in the seatbelt, a last desperate act of rebellion against fate, was useless. He was half free, half trapped, a twisted puppet in an incandescent oven. The smell of his own burning flesh, mixed with the chemical odor of melting plastic and scorched rubber, was nauseating, a cruel reminder of his imminent annihilation. Each breath was agony, the hot, toxic air burning his lungs, robbing him of oxygen and sanity. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the voracious roar of the flames licking the car's interior, devouring the upholstery, the dashboard, every fiber of his former life of luxury. The pain was excruciating, but Marcos's mind, in his last moments of lucidity, played an even crueler trick on him. The image of his mother, not the frail, elderly woman he had abandoned, but the young, smiling woman from his childhood memories, danced before his smoke-blurred eyes. She was not a comfort, but a silent accusation, a ghost of regret that haunted him as the flames consumed him. He felt the heat rise through his body, devouring his clothes, his skin, his hair. A last spasm, a silent scream lost in the crackling fire, and then silence. The final darkness, not of sleep, but of annihilation. The car, now a fireball, transformed wealth into ashes, cruelty into smoke, and Marcos's life into a macabre spectacle of grim justice. Outside, Mrs. Ilara watched the horror with wide eyes, the smoke stinging her retinas. The fire from Marcos's car, previously a mere premonition, was now a funeral pyre, illuminating the pasture with a red-orange glow, casting dancing, ghostly shadows. The heat, even at a distance, was palpable, but it did not warm the icy despair that enveloped her. She saw Colossus, her guardian bull, fall onto one knee, exhausted, his injured leg bleeding profusely. The protective circle was broken, and the hungry night, personified by the manned wolves, was about to claim its prey. The wolves, invigorated by the chaos and Colossus's apparent vulnerability, did not hesitate. Their low, guttural growls formed a menacing chorus, and their eyes, red with the reflection of the flames, gleamed with renewed fury. The pack leader, the same one that had tried to flank Colossus before, wasted no time. With an agile and determined leap, it launched itself directly at Mrs. Ilara, ignoring the injured bull. The elderly woman let out a muffled scream, her eyes wide with terror, seeing the wolf's sharp teeth approach, feeling its hot, wild breath. But Colossus, even on his knees, had not been defeated. With a strength that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he raised his head, his horns sharp as spears. The movement was slow, painful but precise. He intercepted the wolf in midair, not with brute force as before, but with the precision of an experienced warrior. The impact was lesser, but enough to unbalance the animal, which yelped, falling mere inches from the wheelchair, stunned and with a superficial scratch. However, the victory was momentary. The other two wolves, the most cunning, took advantage of the distraction. While Colossus struggled to ward off the leader, they lunged at the bull, biting his hind legs, trying to bring him down completely. Colossus bellowed in pain, a sound that echoed across the pasture, mixing with the crackling fire and the wolves' growls. He tried to stand, but his injured leg couldn't bear the weight. He staggered, and the wolves tightened their encirclement, their teeth tearing at the bull's flesh, seeking to immobilize him. Mrs. Ilara, seeing the scene, felt a chilling despair. Colossus was fighting his last battle, a wounded guardian who refused to yield. She extended her trembling hand, as if she could reach the bull and help him. Tears streamed down her face, not only from fear, but from a deep sadness for the creature that was giving its life for her. Suddenly, a different sound broke the macabre symphony of the night. It wasn't the wolves' howl, nor the crackling of the fire, but a distant, yet constant sound that seemed to come from the road. An engine. Mrs. Ilara raised her head, her tear-filled eyes trying to focus through the smoke and tears. Was it a mirage? A vain hope amidst despair? The wolves also seemed to notice. Their growls subsided, and they raised their heads, sniffing the air, their eyes gleaming in the darkness with a mix of curiosity and caution. The sound approached, louder, clearer. It was the unmistakable rumble of a heavy truck engine coming at high speed, the light from the car fire, now a true bonfire sending tall flames into the night sky, illuminated the pasture with a red and orange glow, revealing the silhouette of a rapidly approaching vehicle. The wolves instinctively retreated a few steps, their hunting instincts clashing with caution. Colossus, exhausted but still alert, also noticed. He snorted, and with a Herculean effort managed to stand, though his legs still trembled violently. He positioned himself again between Mrs. Ilara and the wolves, a wounded guardian, but still standing, determined to fulfill his silent promise. The sound of the engine became a deafening roar, and the truck's powerful, blinding headlights swept across the pasture, illuminating the macabre scene with a cold white light. The wolves, caught off guard by the intense light, hesitated, their sensitive eyes blinking. Some yelped, others retreated into the night's darkness, their wild instincts warning them of imminent danger. The truck stopped abruptly a few meters from the fence, its lights blinding the animals and revealing the figure of a man who leapt from the cabin, wielding a shotgun. It was the farmer, alerted by the smell of smoke and the unusual noise coming from his pasture. The night, which seemed destined to end in tragedy, gained a new and unexpected chapter. The truck engine's roar, now silenced, left a disturbing echo in the air, mixing with the voracious crackle of the burning car. The headlights, like giant, merciless eyes, swept across the pasture, freezing the scene in a raw, white light. The wolves, caught by surprise, yelped and retreated, their slender silhouettes dissolving into the night's darkness, their red eyes blinking one last time before disappearing completely. The farmer, a robust man with a face marked by the sun and country life, leaped from the cabin, shotgun in hand, his breath heavy and panting. He needed no more than a second to process the horror before his eyes. The smell of smoke and burnt flesh was nauseating, the heat from the burning car was palpable, and the sight of the elderly woman in a wheelchair, protected by a huge, injured bull, was surreal. His eyes, accustomed to the calm of the rural night, widened in disbelief. What on earth was happening here? "My goodness," he muttered, his voice hoarse, the shotgun still pointed where the wolves had disappeared. He ran towards Mrs. Ilara and Colossus, his heavy steps on the dew-wet grass. "Are you all right? What happened here?" Mrs. Ilara, paralyzed by shock and relief, couldn't speak. Tears streamed freely down her face, mixing with soot and dirt. She merely pointed a trembling hand at the burning car, a gesture that spoke volumes. The farmer followed her gaze, and what he saw made him swallow hard. Inside the twisted metal carcass, flames danced in a macabre ballet, and the silhouette of a human body was unmistakable. "Is there someone in there?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, horror settling in his chest. Mrs. Ilara nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the inferno consuming her son. There was no sadness in her gaze, only a chilling emptiness, a grim acceptance of fate. The farmer, realizing the gravity of the situation, lowered his shotgun but kept it close. He approached the wheelchair, his eyes scanning the elderly woman, then Colossus. The bull, still standing but visibly exhausted, snorted heavily. His hind leg bled profusely, and multiple minor injuries marked his body. Even wounded, he didn't move from Mrs. Ilara's side, his eyes fixed on the farmer with a mix of distrust and weariness. "Easy, bull, easy," the farmer said, extending a hand slowly, trying not to startle the animal. He had recognized Colossus, the legendary retired rodeo bull he himself had sold to the neighboring ranch years ago. That animal was a legend, and seeing him there, protecting a woman amidst a scene of disaster, was something that defied logic. "I'm João. I'm the farmer here. I'll help you." He knelt beside Mrs. Ilara, checking for visible injuries. She was unharmed, but the shock was evident. Her lips trembled, and she seemed on the verge of collapse. "Are you all right, ma'am? Do you need a blanket, water?" João asked, his voice trying to be comforting. But the scene left a knot in his throat. Mrs. Ilara finally found her voice, a hoarse, weak whisper. "Colossus, he saved me. He saved me from the wolves and from my son." Those words struck João like lightning. "Your son? What did your son do?" The elderly woman, with a look of pain and resignation, began to recount the story, interrupted by sobs and the cough caused by the smoke. She told of the abandonment, the inheritance, Marcos's cruelty. Each word was a blow to João's heart, who listened with a mix of anger and disbelief. He, a simple countryman, couldn't conceive of such wickedness. As she spoke, João watched Colossus. The bull, as if understanding every word, held firm, though his legs trembled. His eyes, previously full of fury, now reflected deep exhaustion, but his loyalty remained unwavering. He was a guardian to the very end. "My God," João murmured, running a hand over his face. The story was so terrible, it seemed straight out of a nightmare. A son abandoning his own mother to die in the middle of nowhere, and an animal, a bull, risking its own life to protect her. The irony was brutal. He grabbed the radio in his truck and called the police and firefighters. His voice choked as he tried to explain the macabre scene. The fire from Marcos's car continued to burn, a funeral pyre illuminating injustice and redemption. The night, which had begun with the darkness of betrayal, was now lit by the light of truth, however grim it might be. Rescue had arrived, but the battle was far from over. The fight for Mrs. Ilara's life had been won, but the battle against human cruelty was just beginning. And Colossus, the hero bull, had proven that loyalty and love could emerge in the most unexpected places. even in a wolf-infested pasture under the shadow of a heinous crime. Joanne's call echoed through the night, laden with an urgency that the rural line could barely support. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens began to tear through the pasture's silence, growing in volume like a chorus of metallic wails rapidly approaching. Pulsing, intermittent red and blue lights danced on the horizon, reflecting in the smoke clouds rising from the burning car. The arrival of civilization, in its most chaotic and necessary form, was imminent. The first to arrive were the firefighters, closely followed by 2 police cars and an ambulance. The scene that unfolded before their eyes was breathtaking, a surreal painting of disaster and heroism. The luxury car, now a smoldering, twisted wreck, still burned with an insatiable fury, sending tall flames against the dark sky. Dense, acrid smoke hung over the pasture, mixing with the smell of burning rubber and flesh. In the center of it all, like a living statue of loyalty, stood Colossus, the injured bull, still on his feet, protecting Mrs. Ilara in her wheelchair. The fire chief, a corpulent man with years of experience in tragedies, stopped abruptly, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of shock and professionalism. "My goodness," he muttered, before giving quick orders. "Team 1, fire suppression. Team 2, secure the area. Paramedics, assess the lady and the farmer." As firefighters hurried to control the flames, unrolling hoses and preparing equipment, police officers approached cautiously. Their headlights joined Joanne's truck, creating a stage of lights that revealed every macabre detail. Lieutenant Almeida, a middle-aged man with a tired but perceptive gaze, was the first to address Joanne. "Sir, what happened here? Who is this lady? And this bull?" The lieutenant's voice was firm, but his disbelief was palpable. Joanne, still holding the shotgun, but now with his guard down, took a deep breath. "I'm Joanne, the farmer here. This is Mrs. Ilara, and this is Colossus. He saved her." He pointed to the burning car. "Her son, Marcos, tried to kill her, abandoned her here for the wolves. The bull flipped his car." Joanne's words fell like heavy stones into the already tense air. Lieutenant Almeida's eyes widened. "What? Abandoned his own mother? And the bull? Flipped the car?" He looked at Mrs. Ilara, who was trembling uncontrollably in her wheelchair, and then at Colossus, who snorted heavily, his legs still trembling, but his eyes fixed on the newcomers, a mix of distrust and exhaustion. Paramedics approached Mrs. Ilara carefully. She was pale, with cracked lips and tear-filled eyes, but physically unharmed. The shock, however, was profound. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" a paramedic asked, her voice soft. As she checked the elderly woman's vital signs, Mrs. Ilara merely nodded, unable to form a complete sentence. She extended a trembling hand towards Colossus, who, as if sensing her distress, lowered his head slightly, allowing her to touch his warm, damp muzzle. That gesture of affection between the frail woman and the imposing bull was a spectacle that silenced everyone. "The bull is injured." "Lieutenant," João interjected, his voice heavy with concern. "The wolves attacked him. He needs a vet urgently." Lieutenant Almeida looked at Colossus's hind leg, which was bleeding profusely, and at the multiple scratches on his body. The scene was unbelievable. A retired rodeo bull, gravely injured, had defended a woman from a pack of wolves and from her own son. The story was so bizarre, it barely seemed real. Meanwhile, firefighters finally managed to control the car's flames. The smoke subsided, revealing the charred and twisted carcass. The smell of burnt flesh intensified, nauseating and unmistakable. The fire chief approached Lieutenant Almeida, his face grim. "Confirmed, Lieutenant. There's a body inside, completely carbonized." Lieutenant Almeida closed his eyes for an instant, processing the information. "Right. Isolate the area. No one touches anything until forensics arrives." He turned to João, his expression now serious and determined. "Mr. João and Mrs. Ilara, we need you to come with us to the station. We need a detailed statement. This is a case of homicide, and attempted homicide, from what I understand." João nodded, the weight of the situation settling upon him. The night of terror was far from over. Mrs. Ilara, supported by paramedics, was carefully removed from her wheelchair and placed on a stretcher. Her eyes, however, did not stray from Colossus. The bull, exhausted but still vigilant, watched every movement, his breathing heavy and noisy. "And the bull?" Mrs. Ilara whispered, her voice weak but laden with concern. "Will he be all right?" João approached, placing a gentle hand on the elderly woman's shoulder. "I'll take care of him, Mrs. Ilara, I promise. I'll call the farm veterinarian. He's the best." João's promise brought a small measure of relief to Mrs. Ilara's eyes. As she was taken to the ambulance, Lieutenant Almeida was already making calls, summoning forensics and the investigation team. The story unfolding in that pasture, under the cold light of headlights and the smell of death, was one of the darkest and most unbelievable he had ever encountered in his career. A son's betrayal, an animal's loyalty, and nature's brutality intertwined in a drama that would shock everyone. The night, which seemed to have reached its climax with the arrival of rescue, now opened a new and complex chapter of justice and redemption. The ambulance siren cut through the night, carrying Mrs. Ilara away from the scene of horror. Inside, paramedics worked with silent efficiency, monitoring her vital signs, which, despite the shock, showed surprising resilience. She was physically unharmed, but her mind carried deep scars. Her eyes, fixed on the blur of lights passing by the window, seemed to relive every moment of that infernal night. The abandonment, the wolves, Colossus's fury, the fire. Everything mingled in a fog of trauma. She felt no physical pain, only a profound exhaustion and a sorrow that seemed endless. The inheritance, the motive for such cruelty, now seemed a cruel joke, worthless in the face of loss and betrayal. Her eyes, still tear-filled, sought the image of Colossus, the bull who, against all expectations, had been her guardian. Gratitude was a faint balm amidst the storm of her soul. In the pasture, the battle scene transformed into a meticulous crime scene. Forensic light swept every inch of the ground, revealing wolf tracks, tire marks, and the smoldering wreckage of the car. The forensics team, accustomed to human brutality, seemed shocked by the case's uniqueness. The smell of burnt metal and charred flesh permeated the air, a poignant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Marcos's body, now just an unrecognizable shadow of his former arrogance, had been removed, wrapped in a black bag, and taken to the morgue. The formality of the law began to swallow the rawness of the facts. João, with a heavy heart, accompanied Dr. Ricardo and his assistant as Colossus was carefully transported. The bull, under the effect of the sedative, still snorted heavily, his injured leg throbbing. Every movement was a silent agony, but the animal's dignity remained intact. In the back of the truck, under the faint light of a flashlight, João saw not just an injured animal, but a hero, a being who had defied death and human malice out of a pure instinct for protection. The promise to care for him was more than a duty. It was a debt of honor. Upon arriving at João's farm, Dr. Ricardo acted with urgency. Colossus was taken to a spacious, clean stable, where the veterinarian and João worked tirelessly. The wolf wounds were cleaned and sutured, the hind leg carefully treated and bandaged. Antibiotics and painkillers were administered. "He'll need time, João," Dr. Ricardo said, wiping sweat from his brow. "A lot of time, and the recovery will be long, but he's a fighter." João merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the sleeping bull. He knew the task would be arduous, but he was determined. Colossus had given his all. Now it was Joan's turn. Back in the pasture, Lieutenant Almeida observed the forensics team's work, his face illuminated by the flashing lights of the patrol cars. The case was a complex puzzle, a web of depravity and heroism. Mrs. Ilara's confession, Joan's testimony, the physical evidence. Everything pointed to a premeditated attempted homicide, followed by the accidental death of the aggressor. The irony was brutal. Marcos, the greedy businessman, had been defeated not by law or morality, but by the brute force and unwavering loyalty of an animal he would likely have considered inferior. Lieutenant Almeida turned to his sergeant. "Make sure every detail is documented, every footprint, every scratch. This case will be a landmark, Sergeant, a son who abandons his mother to die, and a bull who becomes her savior. The world needs to know about this." With Colossus stabilized, Joan said goodbye to Dr. Ricardo and headed to the police station. The night wore on, but adrenaline still coursed through his veins. At the station, Mrs. Ilara, after receiving first aid and being declared physically stable, was already giving her statement, supported by a social worker. Her voice was weak, but her narrative, though punctuated by sobs, was clear and painful. She described Marcos's betrayal, the feeling of abandonment, the terror of the wolves, and Colossus's miraculous arrival. Every word was a blow to the hearts of the police officers present. When João entered the interrogation room, Mrs. Ilara looked up, a flicker of relief and gratitude in her eyes. He sat before Lieutenant Almeida, who had already reviewed the initial statement. "Mr. João, please, start from the beginning. Every detail is important." João, his voice choked with emotion and exhaustion, began to recount the story, from the moment he found the overturned car and Mrs. Ilara protected by Colossus. He described the battle against the wolves, the bull's fury against the car, the elderly woman's confession. Joan's narrative complemented Mrs. Ilara's, painting a complete picture of that night of horror and heroism. Lieutenant Almeida listened with grim seriousness, noting every word. Justice now was not just an abstract concept. It was the promise that the truth would be revealed, that Marcos's wickedness would be exposed, and that Colossus's loyalty would be recognized. The night, which seemed to have reached its climax with the arrival of rescue, now opened a new and complex chapter of justice and redemption. The story of Mrs. Ilara, Marcos, and Colossus was just beginning to unfold. The truth, however grim, would finally come to light, and the consequences would be felt far beyond the confines of that lonely pasture. Justice, human and animal, was in motion, and the world was about to witness its force. In the interrogation room, the night wore on, but the truth, previously hidden by the darkness of the pasture, began to unfold under the cold lights of the police station. Mrs. Ilara, though physically stable, seemed like a ghost, her voice a hoarse whisper that nevertheless carried the weight of monumental betrayal. Supported by the social worker, she relived every moment, every cruel word from Marcos, the feeling of being a disposable burden, the terror of the wolves' hungry eyes. She described the abandonment, her helplessness in the wheelchair, the smell of imminent death, and then the arrival, the imposing figure of Colossus, the barrier of flesh and fury that stood between her and the abyss. Her gratitude, expressed in silent tears, was a balm for her wounded soul. But the pain of filial betrayal was a wound that time would hardly heal. When João began his statement, his voice was choked but firm. He recounted the scene he found, the overturned car, the fire, Mrs. Ilara huddled, and Colossus, the retired bull, in an unwavering circle of protection. The battle against the wolves, the animal fury he never imagined seeing, the blood, the pain, and the bull's indomitable determination. He described Mrs. Ilara's confession, the words that confirmed the horror, and the moment Colossus, like an ancestral guardian, flipped the aggressor's car. Every detail, every emotion was delivered to Lieutenant Almeida, who listened with grim seriousness, meticulously taking notes. Joan's narrative not only complemented Mrs. Ilara's, it painted a vivid picture of heroism and depravity, a tale that defied logic and morality. Lieutenant Almeida, a man accustomed to humanity's darker side, felt a chill down his spine. The case was singular, a mosaic of cruelty and redemption. The evidence was overwhelming. The victim's testimony, the eyewitness, the marks in the pasture, Marcos's carbonized body, Colossus's wounds. Marcos's intent was clear: premeditated homicide, abandonment of a helpless person. The aggressor's death, though tragic for him, was a direct consequence of his own actions, a wild justice delivered by an animal's hooves. The lieutenant knew this case would not just be a record in the police annals, it would be a legend. As the hours dragged on at the police station, the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. But the new day's light did not dispel the shadow of the previous night. The story, like an uncontrollable fire, was already beginning to leak. One of the forensics technicians, shocked by the scene, had made a discreet call. A local reporter, eager for a scoop, published the first lines, and then the explosion. Hero bull saves elderly woman from wolves and avenges cruel son. Headlines screamed in newspapers, news portals, and social media. The story of Marcos, the wealthy businessman who abandoned his wheelchair-bound mother to die for an inheritance, and of Colossus, the retired rodeo bull who became an unlikely guardian, reverberated across the country. Indignation was palpable, a chorus of condemnation against human depravity. But in contrast, admiration for Colossus was overwhelming. He was the hero of the moment, a symbol of loyalty and courage that transcended the barrier of species. At Joan's farm, oblivious to the media storm that was brewing, Colossus fought for his life. Dr. Ricardo had returned for a new assessment, and the news was not the best. "Infections are a concern, Joan," the veterinarian said, his voice grave. "The wolf wounds are deep and dirty, but he's responding to the antibiotics and his spirit. It's unbelievable. He wants to live." Joan spent every free minute by the bull's side, cleaning his wounds, changing his dressings, speaking in encouraging whispers. The recovery would be long and painful, but Joan was determined. Colossus had saved a life. Now Joan would save his. Far from the frenzy in the care home, Mrs. Ilara tried to mend the fragments of her soul. The physical pain lessened, but the wound of Marcos's betrayal was too deep for any painkiller. She refused to watch the news, to hear the sordid details the media regurgitated. The inheritance, once a symbol of security and legacy, was now a poison, stained by her own son's blood and greed. She had instructed her lawyers to formally renounce any right to Marcos's assets. "I want nothing that comes from him," she whispered to the social worker, her voice still weak. "My only inheritance is the life Colossus gave me, and the debt of gratitude I owe him and Joan." Her only wish was to see Colossus. Each day she asked the social worker about the bull's progress. News of his recovery was the only balm for her wounded soul. When she learned he had managed to stand, a wave of emotion washed over her. It was time. She needed to see him, to thank him, to touch his hide. João, after consulting Dr. Ricardo, agreed. The bull was stronger, and Mrs. Ilara's presence could be a stimulus. With care and planning, a day was set. News of the visit spread like wildfire, but João ensured privacy was maintained. That moment was sacred. At the police station, Lieutenant Almeida faced unprecedented pressure. The case, already closed regarding Marcos's death, now transformed into a case study on ethics, morality, and the intersection between human law and natural justice. He ensured that every detail of Mrs. Ilara's and João's testimonies was meticulously documented, that the evidence from the pasture was preserved. Colossus's story would not just be a popular tale, it would be an official record, a testament to an animal's ability to transcend human cruelty. He knew the repercussions would be lasting, and that Marcos's image, the unscrupulous businessman, would forever be linked to his own depravity. While the world debated the nature of heroism and wickedness, Colossus, in his stable, continued his silent struggle. João, his faithful companion, was the bridge between life and death, between pain and hope. With each passing day, the shadow of infection receded a little further, and the bull's strength slowly began to return. The story of Colossus and Mrs. Ilara was not just about a night of horror and a miraculous rescue. It was about the resilience of the spirit, the strength of loyalty, and the ability to find redemption where it was least expected. The world was watching, and life, in its purest and wildest form, was teaching an unforgettable lesson. At João's farm, the fight for Colossus's life was a symphony of pain and hope, played at a slow but steady rhythm. Each day was a small victory, each dressing changed, a battle won. Dr. Ricardo, with his tireless dedication, had become more than a veterinarian. He was an ally, a friend. Infections, previously a constant threat, began to recede, retreating under the persistent attack of antibiotics and meticulous care. The fever, which sometimes frightened João, became less frequent, less intense. The hind leg, the most compromised, was the main focus. Hours were spent on its cleaning and treatment, with João and Dr. Ricardo working in synchronicity, their movements precise and careful. Colossus, the previously indomitable giant, bore the pain with a heartbreaking dignity. His eyes, which had seen the fury of the wolves and human cruelty, now reflected a tired stillness, but also a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. He responded to João's whispers, to his gentle touches, with a slight head movement, a sigh that seemed like relief. Then one day it happened. After weeks of almost total immobility, Colossus tried to stand. It was a monumental effort, a tremor in his powerful muscles, a groan of pain that escaped his throat. João and Dr. Ricardo watched, apprehensive, ready to intervene. Slowly, with his front legs firm, he pushed. The injured hind leg dragged, but he managed. For a few precious seconds, Colossus stood, wobbling but upright. It was a miracle, a testament to his unbreakable will. João felt tears well up, a lump in his throat. The bull was coming back. As life slowly returned to Colossus's body, Mrs. Ilara, in her care home, also began her own healing journey. The physical pain lessened, but the soul's scars were deeper. The image of Marcos, her son, transformed by greed, haunted her thoughts. But the image of Colossus, the silent guardian, was her beacon. She had instructed her lawyers to formally renounce all of Marcos's inheritance. "I want nothing that reminds me of the darkness that consumed him," she had declared, her voice now stronger. "My only inheritance is the life Colossus gave me, and the debt of gratitude I owe him and João." Her only wish was to see Colossus. Each day she asked the social worker about the bull's progress. News of his recovery was the only balm for her wounded soul. When she learned he had managed to stand, a wave of emotion washed over her. It was time. She needed to see him, to thank him, to touch his hide. João, after consulting Dr. Ricardo, agreed. The bull was stronger, and Mrs. Ilara's presence could be a stimulus. With care and planning, a day was set. News of the visit spread like wildfire, but João ensured privacy was maintained. That moment was sacred. On the appointed day, Mrs. Ilara was brought to João's farm. The air was charged with anticipation. She was wheeled to the entrance of Colossus's stable. The bull was lying down, but his eyes lifted when he sensed the familiar presence. The smell of antiseptic still hung in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of hay. Mrs. Ilara was wheeled closer. Colossus watched, his large, dark eyes fixed on her. There was no fury, only a deep stillness. When she was a few feet away, he made an effort, a low groan, and tried to lift his head. Mrs. Ilara extended her hand, trembling, and touched his muzzle. His skin was rough, warm. A wave of emotion overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "My Colossus, my guardian." The bull, in response, let out a soft sigh, almost a purr, and leaned his muzzle into her hand, a gesture of recognition and affection that transcended all barriers. In that moment, the pain of Marcos's betrayal lessened, replaced by overwhelming gratitude and a pure love for the animal who had risked everything for her. The story of Colossus and Mrs. Ilara, meanwhile, continued to resonate around the world. Fundraising campaigns had exceeded all expectations, ensuring not only Colossus's treatment, but also the creation of a sanctuary for retired rodeo bulls, a place where they could live out their final years with dignity. Colossus would be the first and most honored resident. Petitions with millions of signatures demanded that the bull receive an official honor, a recognition of his heroism. Lieutenant Almeida, amidst the avalanche of media attention, ensured that Marcos's case was closed with full documentation of his depravity and the wild justice that had reached him. Colossus's story was not just a tale, it was a precedent, a reminder that loyalty and courage could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Marcos, the wealthy businessman, would forever be remembered not for his fortune, but for his cruelty, a name stained by greed and betrayal. João, the man who had cared for Colossus with such love, became the sanctuary's guardian, dedicating his life to protecting and caring for animals who, like Colossus, deserved a second chance. He had found his purpose, his place in the world, alongside the bull who had changed everything. Colossus, the retired rodeo bull, the unlikely guardian, the four-legged hero, recovered completely. He would never again return to an arena, but his legend would be told for generations. His story, and Mrs. Ilara's, was a testament to the resilience of the spirit, the ability to find redemption in the face of cruelty, and the undeniable truth that heroism knows no species, only hearts. The world had learned an unforgettable lesson, etched in fire and iron in the annals of history. The purest loyalty and the grandest sacrifice can come from where it is least expected, and justice sometimes has hooves and horns.